This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Make sure I don't run away. That's right. All right.
Welcome. I'm very glad to have you tonight. My name is Phil Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Aquinas Center of Theology. It is our pleasure, along with the Candler School of Theology and Dean Love, I welcome you here. They are the co-sponsors with us of this, the third annual Major Catholic Speaker Lecture. Other lectures, as you may know, included Cardinal Walter Casper from the Vatican, President John Jenkins of the University of Notre Dame, Marianne Glendon from Harvard Law School, and now our fourth Major Catholic Speaker, Timothy Radcliffe, the former Master General of the Dominican Order and a very noted spiritual and theological writer. Father Ratcliffe, over the last couple of days, he's gone to classes, he's met with scholars. I've been with him to a number of events, and you are in for a real treat tonight. I guarantee you. I've told people this may be the best lecturer we ever have, and that's very unfair of me to say because now I've set the expectations astronomically high for Father Ratcliffe, which is not fair. But I will stand by my words, and I think you'll see what I mean at the end here. This is the 25th anniversary of the Aquinas Center of Theology. And when the Aquinas Center of Theology opened in 1987, we had formerly been the Dominican House of Studies, and we morphed into the Aquinas Center of Theology, an affiliate of Emory University, a lay institute here on the campus of Emory. And the initial article, I went back to the Georgia Bulletin, the Catholic newspaper here. I went back to the original article talking about the opening of the Aquinas Center, and the words here remind me of where we are today. Dominican Father Bob Perry, who was running the Aquinas Center at that time, said, "We want to bring the Roman Catholic tradition into the broad context of the Southeast. Such a step will strongly and favorably affect area Catholics, he feels, since there is no scholarly center for Catholics in Atlanta." But he's also said, moreover, Emory is the type of university that has a marvelous reputation for teaching resources, research, and a strong ecumenical component and commitment. For its part, Emory was pleased with the affiliation, and the president said, "I'm delighted with the establishment of the Aquinas Center at Emory. This will greatly strengthen our attractiveness to the Catholic community in general, and particularly to the Catholic students in the School of Theology. This is one more step in making Emory a genuinely scholarly community." And we are very proud of, since 1987, we've had over 400 programs at Emory University and in the community. We've had lectures, we've had conferences, seminars, art exhibits, you name it. We've had a number of different kinds of programs which we have presented to this community over the past 25 years. And all of this can be sort of summed up in our new motto, transforming lives through the search for God's wisdom. And that's what all of those programs have been about, and that is what tonight is about, transforming lives in the search for God's wisdom. And I have a confession to make on Father Ratcliffe's topic here, the lecture title, The Christian Imagination, the Contemporary Search for Wisdom. I was sort of naughty. I said, could you change the end of that to put in search for wisdom, because that would really fit with our motto. And he most graciously agreed, because he knows that any good speaker can talk. It doesn't really matter what the title is. They're going to talk about what they want to talk about anyway. And so we had a nice exchange on that point. We have some unique aspects of the Aquinas Center. We were the first Catholic academic center at a non-Catholic university in the United States. We also have the first Catholic Studies minor at a non-Catholic university. And we're very proud about where we're going, and we look forward. We've gone through a strategic review process, and we have many exciting events coming up, including, we're grateful to say, we have Miss Louise Florencourt here tonight, who's one of the trustees of the Flannery O'Connor Trust, and thanks to their generosity, we're going to have a series of major lectures on Flannery O'Connor over the next 3 years. So you can look forward to that. Well, that's very exciting. And it's very exciting to have, as I mentioned, Father Ratcliffe here tonight. I got an email, and I think these are very good words. Somebody who'd read a lot of Timothy Ratcliffe. He said, it's very good that you're going to have him because he will surely make people think. And if we're on the process towards God's wisdom, we need people who will help us to think. So with that, I'm going to ask Father Wayne Cavalier, who's a member of the Aquinas Center Board, also a Dominican priest of the Southern Province, to introduce his fellow Dominican, Timothy Ratcliffe. Wayne?
Thank you. I just leaned over to Timothy and I said, it looks like some people have heard of you. He said, I think they think it's the annual striptease. I said, don't go there. It is an extreme personal privilege and pleasure to introduce to you our major Catholic speaker this evening, fellow itinerant preacher and beloved brother, Timothy Ratcliffe. Timothy entered the order of preachers, commonly called the Dominicans after our 13th century founder, St. Dominic, in 1965, ordained a priest in 1971, and taught scripture at Oxford University in the famous Dominican Center of Studies known as Blackfriars. He was elected provincial of the English province of the Order of Preachers in 1988. In 1992, he was elected Master of the Order of Preachers and completed his 9-year term in 2001. As your program indicates, he is the only member of the English province of the Dominicans to have held the office since the order's foundation in 1216. He would tell you that that says more about the English province than it does about him. From the moment of his election as Master of the Order of Preachers, Brother Timothy has used that global vantage point to really look at the world around us and to express the gospel vision anew in terms that make sense in that world. Instead of avoiding the most difficult situations where his Dominican brothers and sisters were ministering to the poorest of the poor, he was drawn to them and transformed his encounters there into words that gave voice to the voiceless at every opportunity his role as Master of the Order afforded him, even creating new opportunities not previously recognized by his predecessors. Close to his heart have been the questions of young Christians today about what it means to live in this world as a Christian. Rather than shrinking from those questions, he has immersed himself in them, contemplating them, and sharing the fruits of his contemplation with those who struggle with them, joyfully offering them hope without diminishing the complexity of the questions. Timothy has often described Catholic religious life, of which the Order of Preachers is one example, as a strange form of life, requiring the support of a particular ecosystem to help it thrive. The same, of course, is true of Christian life today. In our highly polemical climate, this gentle way of getting at what it means to be a Christian in the contemporary world characterizes the whole of Timothy's preaching project now since his time as Master of the Order. He does not seek to out-argue or browbeat those who do not share his hopeful vision for the role of Christianity in our day. He simply spends every ounce of his formidable energy helping to create an environment that sustains the possibility for an essential form of life to thrive in our world, like tilling the soil into which a mustard seed might fall, or kneading the dough into which yeast might be applied. Yet, in all these things and so much more you can read about on your program cover or discover by Googling him, despite his many extraordinary accomplishments, I know, the accolades he cherishes the most are the ones with which I began. On behalf of the Aquinas Center of Theology and the Candler School of Theology, I am delighted to present to you a quintessential itinerant preacher of the gospel and a dearly beloved brother, Timothy Ratcliffe.
Good evening. If you can't hear me, please wave, and I'll wave back. You know, they say that if they applaud you at the beginning, it's an act of faith. If they applaud you halfway through, it's an act of hope. And if they applaud you at the end, it's an act of charity. Thank you so much for inviting me to come here to Atlanta. I wish I could have spent some time with you. I would love to have heard, what are your concerns? What are your questions? How do you think? Because there can never be any preaching until you've listened. And so please forgive what's irrelevant and just accept what's useful. As with almost every lecture, I think of one of my brethren who gave a lecture in Chicago. And when he sat down, there wasn't much charity. The applause was rather feeble. And he sat down and he said to the man beside him, he said, I hope it wasn't that bad, was it? And the man said, oh, I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. I just blame whoever asked you to come and speak in the first place. Just a month ago, I was in the big central hall at Oxford University to listen to a debate between Richard Dawkins and Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So on the one side, you had the famous aggressive atheist. Though I mentioned aggressive atheism in a YouTube once, and I got a letter from somebody who said, how dare you call us atheists aggressive, you miserable little wimp. That's before she got aggressive. Then on the other hand, you had the very urbane, sophisticated, holy man, Rowan Williams. Do you know, I don't think the debate ever really took off. Rowan made an immense effort to get into the scientific world of Richard Dawkins, and we were all fascinated by what Dawkins said about evolution. There was not a word really there that I don't think that any of us would have disagreed with. They were scientific statements which need to be judged as science. But the trouble was that Dawkins was unable to get into the Christian imagination of the Archbishop. He simply couldn't get it. My feeling at the end was that he was no doubt a good scientist, fine man, but he was imaginatively impoverished. It was like listening to somebody who's got no musical sensitivity, listening to Bartok and being unable to make any sense of it. I'm a great admirer of a Korean Dominican painter called Kim En-young. And he paints these wonderful, great big abstract paintings with white and lots of color everywhere. And I remember I asked him to give me one for my office in Rome. And when my mother came to visit me, I said, Ma, isn't this fantastic? And she said, my dear, it looks like your habit after a particularly messy breakfast. I think the challenge for Christianity, at least in the secularized West, is not so much an intellectual one faced with atheism. I think it's much more an imaginative one. To try to pull back the veil a little bit so the people glimpse the wisdom that we offer. There you are. You see, Philip, I brought in the word wisdom. Science offers us knowledge, which is good and fine, to be judged in its own terms, to be accepted insofar it is scientifically established. But what philosophy and our faiths offer is wisdom, some glimpse, perhaps often given by poetry or music, of our ultimate end, that for which we exist. How many of you have seen an extraordinary film, a French film, called Des Hommes et des Dieux, or in English, Of Gods and Men? Many of you, yes, thanks be to God. I'd say almost most of you, a little pocket of ignorance over there. We'll pray for them. Brent, I spotted you not putting your hand up. It's an extraordinary film. It won major prize at the Cannes Film Festival last year. It was seen by 10 million people in France in the first month. It really shook people in Britain. It's a true story of a small community of Trappist monks who lived in the Atlas Mountains in the 90s. Virtually every word is from their diaries or their letters. They were deeply embedded in the local Muslim community. They were loved, and they loved them. And then they find themselves caught in a rising violence between, on the one hand, Islamicist terrorists, and on the other hand, the army. And what the film does is it explores their tortured arrival at consensus that they must stay, even though this may cost their lives. And on the 31st of May, 1996, they were taken away into the mountains and they were beheaded. I went to see this film with a friend of mine who's an atheist. On good days, I suppose he's an agnostic. The cinema was filled with people like yourself, intelligent students and faculty from the university, though probably a much higher percentage would not be Christian. At the end of the film, there was complete silence. You know, when you go to the cinema, nobody wants to leave. Everybody hangs on to the last minute, see who the best boy was, who did the hair. I suppose I was especially moved because I'd been to visit Algeria, where they'd lived, about a month after their murder. The local bishop, not actually their diocese, but the neighboring diocese, was a Dominican, Pierre Claverie, and he had received death threats too. And so a couple of us went to give our support. Every day, Pierre had to telephone to see where it might be safe to go that day, because they were trying to catch him. And then 4 weeks later, on the 1st of August, he went back to the bishop's house with a young friend, Muhammad, who'd been driving for him that day, and they were waiting. And there was a bomb built into the side of the wall, which they exploded, and they utterly pulverized his Muslim friend. When I arrived for the funeral 3 days later, I found a sister still collecting bits of their bodies with a teaspoon. Now, what you may ask me, why don't I give you a theory of Christian imagination? Why do I want to talk about a film which some of you, naming no names, some of you haven't seen. And the reason is very, very, very clear for me. And that is because Christian imagination always homes in on particular people in a particular community. Our belief is in a particular Jewish person who lived 2,000 years ago. And in that man, we find universal significance. But the Christian imagination always passes through particular people, flesh and blood. The ideologies that crucified the 20th century and left 100 million people dead, ideologies like fascism and communism, were always in some sense abstract. A month ago, a modern poet, a Polish poet called Wisława Szymborska, she died. She'd originally been a communist poet, but she gave up communism, she said, because in the end it was abstract. I did it out of love for mankind, she said. But then I realized you shouldn't love mankind, but people. Even science, in a sense, is abstract. So I think that what grabbed people, what turned us, what bowled us over in this film was here were particular monks living in a community. And it was a community because it let them be particular. Any true community lets you be an individual. And they were so brilliantly acted that it was almost impossible to believe that they weren't the real monks. I mean, I've been a religious for almost 50 years. I can spot a phony monk in a nanosecond. There's a lovely scene, which some of you will remember, when one old monk is washing up and he gets on the nerves of the young monk who tells him, I put it discreetly, to F off. And I thought, yeah, here's somebody who knows about religious life. You see, in a world which always tends to the abstract, Christianity passes through the particular. And that's why, from the beginning, saints mattered. Because saints were people who dared to be themselves. You remember St. Catherine of Siena said, rough translation, she said to her friend Stefano, be the person God made you to be, and you will set the world alight. Saints are people who refuse off-the-peg identities, prefabricated identities. I asked a young 18-year-old friend of mine called Michael, I said, well, who are the people that everybody wants to be like today? And he told me Beyoncé, Rihanna, Katie Price, Brad Pitt, Wayne Rooney. I'd never heard of half these people. But they're the people everybody follows on Twitter, listen to their songs, wear their clothes, go to their barbers. I'll tell you the name of my barber if you want a considerable amount of money. They seek, if you want, an identity which is a brand. Douglas Edwards worked for Google for many years. He wrote, everything I owned for a while had the Google logo. Umbrellas, towels, T-shirts, boxer shorts. Every pen I picked up, every piece of paper, Google in some ways took over who I was. But it's an illusion. We can only, in the end, find happiness in being the person God made me to be. I could never be Brad Pitt. I know we are frequently confused. It's so difficult for him. Once I went to a book signing in Paris, at the Procure, which is the great big bookshop in the center of Paris. And there were hundreds of people lining up for signatures of my books, and I couldn't understand what had happened until I heard somebody say, "It is the uncle of Harry Potter." I didn't say anything. The saint is essentially nonconformist. The saint is the person who refuses to belong to the crowd, who will not be caught up in the mob. The saint is the person who dares to be faithful to the person that God made. The hero of I've got to up the level a bit, so here's Iris Murdoch, nuns and soldiers. Our vices are general. The dull, ordinary mud of human meanness and cowardice and cruelty and egoism, even when they're extreme, they're all the same. Only in our virtues are we original. Vices are general. Virtues are particular. Why do we take refuge in these prefabricated identities? I heard somebody at Oxford say the other day, when he was up at Oxford, he was the third most intelligent person. Or sexiest, or holy, or whatever. I think we take refuge in prefabricated identities because we dare not believe that we were beloved as we are. And the saint is the person who dares to take that risk. So that's the first thing I want to say. The Christian imagination always passes to the universal, the transcendent, via the particular. In this case, these monks living together. Now the prior, Christian de Clerget, was convinced from the beginning that the community must stay. But the brethren weren't entirely sure. One of the monks says to him, "Look, Christian, we didn't elect you to take decisions for us." The youngest, Christophe, originally is very eager to go. And he says, "I didn't become a monk to die." And the prior says, "But you've already given your life away." And what this film shows is the slow, patient labor of coming to the right decision. It's fascinating to watch them helping each other on the way. You see, the demands of Christianity can't be put bluntly, literally. If you go on the Underground in London, you will see all these signs up. God is love. He died for you. Repent and believe the gospel. My favorite one is the one who says, "Would you rather watch with the wise virgins or sleep with the foolish ones?" But if you don't already believe, these words don't mean anything to you. People's eyes glaze over them. The words of faith have to be discovered imaginatively. You have to journey towards the moment of illumination. When Jesus meets people, what he usually does is he asks them questions. He doesn't tell them facts. The whole of John's Gospel is structured around questions. The first question, the first words of Jesus in John are, "What do you seek? What did you seek?" The first words of Jesus after the resurrection are to Mary Magdalene. "Why are you weeping?" The first questions on the beach to Peter are, "Do you love me? Do you love me more than these others?" And the very last words of Jesus in the gospel, after all these questions, is he ends on another question concerning the beloved disciple. If he were to remain, what is it to you? So Jesus just doesn't give us nice, wrapped up, easy answers. He questions us. Most of the parables are questions. The Good Samaritan starts with a question. Who is my neighbor? Jesus ends with another question. Who is neighbor to the man who lay on the street? What parables do is they put you on the spot. They don't give you the answer. There's a Pharisee in the temple, and he says, "I thank you, Lord, that I am not like all these other people." And then there's the miserable sinner at the back who just says, "Lord, have mercy on me. I am a sinner." And Jesus says, he's the one who went out justified. But he doesn't say why. Each of us has to make the journey. Each of us has to discover. It's like a Japanese koan, you know? Slaps you in the face and says, think, search. The Scottish poet, George Mackay Brown, he said, the poet interrogates the silence. I'd say what the believer does is he lets himself or herself be interrogated by the silence. And that's why the transmission of faith is never just the repetition of what you've been told. Christian doctrine doesn't wrap it all up, so you can simply repeat it. That's what heresy does. Heresy wraps it up, nice, neat theory. There you got the answer. Always too small. What Christian doctrine does is it invites you to journey. It provokes you. It carries you on a bit further into the mystery of the one who is truly God and truly human, or the one who is three in one. G.K. Chesterton talked about the adventure of orthodoxy. It's always traveling. Our society has a dogmatic rejection of dogma. And so we Christians are often tempted to sell our faith as a nice bit of gentle spirituality, light a couple of candles, and some incense, you know, a bit of Myers-Briggs psychology. But that's to undersell the great and exciting, provocative, difficult doctrines which will move us on the way. I think if we want to have the young, we must be unafraid to give them the very best. I'm reminded of one of my brethren in the New York province who was a little bit over fond of alcohol. And he went to see his doctor. And the doctor said, "Father, the very best thing you could do would be to give up drinking altogether." So my brother said, "Doctor, I am not worthy of the very best," he said. What's the second best? So that's why the transmission of our faith always, in a way, lights anew a new light. I don't know whether you have, I know in Boston you've got Beacon Hill. Have you got any beacons here in Atlanta? Well, maybe you could start one tomorrow, but in the old days, the good news or the bad news was transmitted by beacons. You lighted your bonfire, somebody saw it, and they lighted their bonfire. And so the news traveled through the land. And just as on the Easter Vigil, we light a fire, and it's transmitted to the candles, who light other candles. So our faith is transmitted when people light their own bonfire. Let me give you a little example. It's a bit embarrassing. I have a minor role in the middle of it. In 17th century Peru, the Jesuits invented a new devotion called the 7 Last Words of Christ. And this was in particular response to the suffering of the indigenous people. It's a meditation founded on the Ignatian exercises that was intended to respond to the suffering of these people. The light that was lit on Calvary found a new form, a new flame. About 100 years later, Haydn was asked to compose music for the 7 Last Words in the Cathedral of Cadiz in the south of Spain. A new light. It passed through his own creative genius. In 1993, I went to see my father, who was dying. I was summoned back from Jerusalem, where I was at the time. And 3 days before he died, I said to my father, "What can I do? Is there anything I can bring?" And he said, "Bring me my Walkman. I want to listen to Haydn's 7 Last Words and to Mozart's Requiem." Faced with death, faced with extinction, what have you got except for poetry and music to express your faith? Poems. I was asked to preach myself on the 7 Last Words in Seattle in 2002. And I lit my little fire looking back to my father, being present with him as he faced death, looking back to Haydn, looking back to Lima, looking back to the evangelists. And then a year later, I was sitting in the common room of Blackfriars, and one of my Dominican students came in and he said, "Oh, I'm delighted to see you're publishing a new book." I said, "Well, that's news. I didn't know I was. What's it called?" He said, "It's called 7 Last Words." "Oh, well, that's news." Anyway, so I then had to write the book. A year ago, I was contacted by a head teacher from a school in the west of England. And she had commissioned a group of local schools to put my book to music. These young kids, teenagers, had composed their own songs, taking passages from the Gospels and some of the stuff I wrote. In April last year, I went down to Plymouth Cathedral, and they played their musical. It's on CD now. It's wonderful. I don't understand half of it, but it's transmitted through their creativity, their inventiveness. As Jesus said, quoting as the book of Apocalypse said, "Behold, I make all things new." So the transmission of faith, imaginatively, always has to engage the creative imagination of the hearer so that they make something a little bit different, a little bit new, unexpected. There are many tensions in our beloved church today, often between different generations. And I know some people from my generation, you know, trendy old 60s liberals. Many of our generation, they look on the young and they say, oh, they're all so conservative. You know, they've betrayed all that we've labored for. But in a way, you see, if you hand over the faith, the next generation won't do what you did with it. You have to let them be. You have to let them make something new. And you must have imaginative sympathy with what they do, even if it's very different from what you were trying to do 30 years ago. Now, not all interpretations are valid. Some are indeed betrayals. How you distinguish between a valid reinterpretation and one that's sterile and old, we haven't time to go into that this evening. Somehow you entrust the body of Christ, which is the church, to do so. You know, it's like when you listen to a new interpretation of a Beethoven quartet, try to discern what's creative and fresh and what's simply boring. I'm reminded of a comment on an essay, a philosophy essay at Oxford. The most damning comment ever. It simply said, not even wrong. Not even wrong. The film ends with the monks climbing the mountain into the snow to go to their death. And it looks like a defeat. It looks like they failed. But I bet you there was no one in that cinema, even people who don't believe in Christianity, who didn't feel that it was a great victory. Watching them go into the snow tenderly, helping each other forward. You had a sense of the paradoxical victory which is at the heart of our faith. Every society needs a story about the victory of goodness. Otherwise, our sufferings have no meaning, and our lives are senseless. But what's the story that you and I tell? In the Old Testament, usually the story of the victory of goodness is that all those fat cats are going to get it in the neck. They're going to be smashed. God will have his day of revenge. But in Christ, we see another paradoxical story of the victory of goodness, when he refuses the armies of angels of his Father, and he dies on a cross, forgiving. Now, we all know this in theory. Every church, every city in America has dozens of churches filled with images of the crucified Messiah. But we don't easily get it. Peter and the disciples, when the end came, they didn't get it. They thought he was a failure. 2,000 years after the resurrection, often we don't get it. Most films lead up to a final denouement when the good beat the bad. That's our catharsis. If we're lucky, it takes the form of a court case, when at the last minute, the brilliant lawyer snatches victory and the bad guy goes to jail. Jane Malcolm, who's an American crime reporter, she said, "Hey, we got the killer. Don't worry. You can go to the playground. nothing's going to happen. More usually, the triumph is the death of the bad person. I went to see 2 films on consecutive nights in Oxford last year. They couldn't have been more different. One was Avatar. It's a story, you know, about 8-foot-tall blue Californians. And the other was Sherlock Holmes, you know, our local man. But they both end in identical ways, with a shootout at the OK Corral. John Wayne shoots the bad guy. Wasn't it sad that the mission to kill Osama bin Laden had the code name Geronimo, a Native American? Don't we ever learn? So after 2,000 years, we largely have a pre-Christian imagination when we think about the victory of goodness. And the truth of our faith, of the victory of the non-violent Christ, has to be recaptured time and again. We get it, and then we lose it. As T.S. Eliot said, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Just before, I think I'm going to have to cut this lecture off very shortly. Shortly before he died, Christian de Clerget wrote a letter to the person he thought was going to kill him. It's written on the wall of the cell where he lived in Paris at the Institut Catholique. I was there just a week ago tonight. And he wrote, if it should happen one day, and it could be today, that I become a victim of the terrorism which now seems ready to encompass all foreigners in Algeria, I would like my community, my church, my family to remember that my life was given to God and to this country, and to accept that the one master of all life was not a stranger to this brutal departure. For this life lost, totally mine and totally theirs, I thank God, who seems to have wished it for the sake of that joy in and in spite of everything. Here he addresses the man who will kill him. And you too, my last-minute friend, who will not know what you are doing. Yes, for you too, I say this, thank you, and this adieu, to commend you to this God, in whose face I see yours. And may we find each other happy, good thieves in paradise, if it please God, the Father of us both. Amen. Inshallah. That's the victory. That's the victory. Tender words in the face of violence. And if I may give myself 2 minutes more too, please. Finally, I think what bowls us over with this film is the sense of God's closeness. That God is close. We're terrified of intimacy with God, and we long for it. As Madonna said, swapping over 3 pages in her rapidly, Jesus, will you look at me? Don't know who I'm supposed to be. Or Joan Osborne in a song called What If God Is One of Us? What if God were one of us, just a slob like one of us, just a stranger on a bus, trying to make his way home? In the end, I think in the love of these monks, we encounter God as close. And what I leave you with is, when have you known the proximity of God? When have you discovered God as Emmanuel, God with us? For me, perhaps one of the great moments was Christmas 1996, a few months after the assassination of my friend Pierre, celebrating the Eucharist in Paris with a Spanish Dominican called Pedro Meca. Pedro is the chaplain to the tramps. He lives on the street. He comes back once a week to his priory to have dinner with his brethren. He washes first, has a quick shower first. And when you saw 1,000 homeless people gathered around an altar made of cardboard, for all those people who live in cardboard, and when he opened the bottle at the offertory and wild cheers rang out through the crowd, slightly befuddled happiness, celebration had perhaps started a bit early, then you said, God is here. And that's what we must share with people. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.